Hi students, welcome back to the next video of this chapter wherein we will cover some questions and quick revision of this chapter. So let's move forward. Okay, so the first question says, what are the advantages? What are the advantages of the foreign companies in setting up the production in India? So as we have already discussed in the previous video that why Union Carbide established its company or established its factory in India and why not in some other country. So why do you think? I've already discussed some major points as to why Union Carbide established its factory in India and not in some other country. So the major points that we discussed, the very first point was the cheap labor. The very first point was the cheap labor. The second point was the other benefits. The other benefits like housing facilities. The third reason was the lack of laws. And the very fourth reason was corruption, which makes easier for the industry to be set up. Okay. These four are the major points as to why the foreign companies got attracted and set up or established its factories in India. So let's discuss each of these points in detail now. So let's first start with cheap labor. So as to why, what is cheap labor and what do we mean by cheap labor? So as we all know that there is unemployment in our country, right? People do not have job. People are basically willing to do job, but they do not have it. So if any kind of industry would be set up in India, it would be very easy for that industry to get the labor, because people over here do actually want to work, but they do not find work. So obviously it is quite evident, it is quite obvious that if people do want to do the job but they're not getting it, if they'll get it, they will be ready to do job at any wage rate. All right. Obviously, this is quite obvious that if people do not have job and if they are getting a job, even though they're getting it at a very low wage rate, they will accept the job, right? And this was an advantage for the foreign company to set up their industry in India. They were getting a very cheap labor in India. Yeah. So it becomes quite obvious for the industries, to set up in India, because cheap labor is being available in India. People are ready to do work at any wage rate. So this is one of the reasons. Moving on to the other reason, which says other benefits like housing facilities. Now what do we mean by this? So as we understood, as we read the difference between Virginia and India and how sharp the differences were. So in US there are basically some facilities which are to be provided to the worker along with the wages. Now what is it? Basically other facilities like housing facilities. You need to give accommodation, proper accommodation to the worker who is working in the factory, and no such law of giving housing facilities is being enforced in our country, and this saves a lot of money for the industry. So why not the industry would be ready to set up itself in India? So this is the second reason. The third reason is basically the other laws, like a law isn't made in the country wherein you need to give training to the workers which are working, like the training related to the safety measures. So no such strict laws are being made in our country that you need to give the training to the workers in case of emergency, or you need to actually give the minimum wage rate to the workers that work in your factory, or you need to make evacuation plans in your factory. So no such strict safety laws are being implemented, and this saves a lot of cost for the industry, right? So that is why it is very easy for the foreign companies to set up their industries in India, and that is why they get attracted towards setting their industry in India, and which is an advantage to the foreign companies. The very fourth law says corruption, which makes easier for the industry to be set up. Now what do we mean by this? So basically what do we mean by corruption is, as we read one of the point in the previous video, wherein the government official was very lenient, even though he realized that it will be little harmful to set up an industry around the residential area, but still, because he knew that it will give employment to a lot many people, he became a little lenient, considering the fact that it is okay to set up an industry around the residential area. He was like, we'll see when it will happen, or nothing will happen, like that. So he was really lenient in that point. So this is not basically related to corruption, but this was just one of the examples. The point which is related to corruption is because when you set up an industry now, you have to go through a lot of legal procedures also. It is not easy to set up an industry wherever you want to. And so it becomes really hectic. You need to go through a lot of legal procedures if you want to set up an industry, right? And so in India it is very easy. You give the money to the official, to the government official, any government officer, and he will make it very easier for you to set up the industry. You do not have to go through that hectic procedure. And though this makes it very easy for the foreign companies to set up in in India, also, in many countries, it is not allowed to set up an industry around the residential area. And in India, since there are no such laws which prohibits it, it becomes very easier for the foreign companies to set up around the residential area. Also, because it is very easy to find the labor when you have an industry around the residential area, it becomes very easy now to find the labor. And so there are no such laws also in our country that prohibits setting up the industry around the residential area. So it is very easy. So it becomes very easy for the foreign companies. And even though there are laws saying that it is not allowed to set up an industry around the residential area, the foreign companies can give money to the government officer, and they make it very easy for them to do so. So corruption and the lack of laws in our country and the cheap labor makes it very advantageous for the foreign company to set up their industry in India. Here in the third point, I don't mean laws of laws, I meant to basically say lack of laws. It wasn't laws of laws, it was lack of laws, lack of safety laws, lack of minimum wages laws, etc. Okay, moving on. Do you think the victims of Bhopal gas tragedy got justice? No. A straight no. They did not actually give the justice, because as we read in one of the slides, that even after so many years of the tragedy, they still actually protest. They still come together and raise their voice. They still want the owner of the factory to put into the jail. He's not get into the jail even after such a bad damage. Due to the tragedy, the owner of the factory hasn't been put in the jail. And this is the reason why the victims of Bhopal gas tragedy hasn't been given justice till now. Also, I told you this one point wherein I told you that, after so many years of the tragedy, the babies that were born in Bhopal were born with some or the other abnormalities because of the inhalation of the poisonous gas by their mothers or fathers at that time during the tragedy. So that had actually passed on to their babies, and the babies are born with the abnormalities. So this is an indirect injustice with those people, that now their babies are born with the abnormalities. So this is quite evident to say, it is quite obvious to say that the victims of the Bhopal gas tragedy hasn't got justice yet. Okay, what do we mean when we speak of the law enforcement? Who is responsible for the law enforcement, and why enforcement is so important? So let's just first take up the very first part, which says, what do we mean when we speak of the law enforcement? As I have already told you, law enforcement is nothing but law implementation. Law implementation. Merely just making a law and writing on a piece of paper won't help the people that we really want to help, or won't safeguard the people from the exploitation, right? We need to actually implement the law. We need to enforce the law. What do we mean by implementation? The government needs to check whether the laws which have been made in the country are being followed by each and every one or not. Who is responsible for the enforcement? Already answered. The government is responsible for responsible for the for the implementation of the law, for the enforcement of the law. Now, why is enforcement so important? So let's just understand that what do we mean by law enforcement and who is responsible for the enforcement in detail now. So now we know that law enforcement is law implementation, and who is responsible? The government is responsible. So the government is basically responsible for the implementation of the laws by actually checking if the laws are being followed by each and every one or not. And in case anybody violates the laws, that person is basically will be punished or will have to pay a penalty for it. And it also has to check that whether they are being actually followed or not, right? More than being violated, if they are actually being followed or not. So law enforcement is the implementation of the law, by the government. It is important. Now let's answer the third part, which says, why is enforcement so important? So it is important because if the laws will be implemented properly in the country, let's just take an example of a law which is not being implemented in the country. Okay, let's say that the law of Minimum Wages Act. If this law gets implemented in the country, all the workers who are forced to work under the bounded wages, under less wages, will actually get safeguarded. They won't have to work under such a low wages. They basically there is unemployment in our country, and that is why whichever job they get, they actually take it. Now, no matter the wages low or high, it doesn't matter to them. What matters is that they're getting a job. And if there will be Minimum Wages Act, under this act, basically Minimum Wages Act is when there is a particular minimum wage that is fixed, that beyond this particular number, nobody would be basically a number is fixed beyond which the person is not paid. For example, let's say 700 is the minimum wage that is fixed, that beyond 700 nobody will be paid less than 700. No worker will be paid less than 700. So here 700 is the minimum wage which is being fixed. So this is Minimum Wages Act, wherein a minimum wage is being fixed, and beyond that number, beyond that let's say 700, beyond that figure, no worker is paid beyond that particular amount that is already being fixed by the government. Now, why or how does Minimum Wages Act help? So basically, it will help the workers to not get exploited by the by the private companies, by the private factories, by the private industries. They won't get exploited. It will safeguard them from being exploited by the private companies. Now, if there will be a Minimum Wages Act, the private companies also cannot give them very low wages, right? And in case that they do so, they will be punished for the same. So that is why enforcement is so important. Now, to be very precise, enforcement is important to safeguard the poor section of the society from being exploited by the private companies, private players, private industries in the market. So that is why enforcement is so important. Moving on. How can laws ensure that markets work in a manner that is fair? Give 2 examples to support your answers. How can laws ensure that markets work in a manner that is fair? So basically, how can markets work? How can laws ensure that markets work in a manner that is fair? So market, as we know that market has government players, market has government sector, and market has private sector. We know Now, the government sector is basically service driven. It works for providing the service for the betterment of the society. It is service driven. Whereas the private sector is nothing but profit driven. It is profit driven, and in order to earn profit, it exploits the poor section of the society also. In order to cut down its cost, it also cut down the duration of the training program for the workers. So it is quite evident that the private sector, in order to earn profit, can do anything, can even do the loss for the workers, can exploit the workers. So how laws ensure that markets at these private sector as well as the government sector work in a manner which is fair, which they are actually not working currently. So laws actually ensure this. Now how laws ensure this is basically if a law is being made in the country and it is properly being implemented, that it is properly being checked regularly by the government, regularly on a regular basis by the government, that if everybody is following the law or not, and if the government officials, if the government is actually punishing the person who is violating the law or not following the law, this is how everybody will actually realize that they will have to follow the law, otherwise they will be punished, otherwise they can be asked for the penalty, otherwise they can be put into the jail. So a law ensures that a market work in a fairer manner by punishing them, by punishing the people who are violating the law, by actually putting the people in the jail who are not following the law, and so on and so forth. Basically punishing the people who are not following the law or are violating the law. So this is how laws can ensure that markets work in a manner that is fair. Give two examples to support your answer. Okay, so the very first example is of the Minimum Wages Act. Now, the Minimum Wages Act ensures that a worker would not be given a wage beyond this particular amount which is being fixed by the government. So, we took the example of rupees 700. So, let's say that 700 for per day is being fixed by the government, and no private industry would give an amount which is lesser than 700 to the worker. So, 700 here is the minimum wage that is being fixed by the government. So, this particular act has helped the workers from being exploited by these private industries. So this is how the laws ensures that markets work in a fair manner. So this particular act has basically encouraged the private industries to work in a fairer manner that they were not, because they know that if they would not work in a fair manner, if they would violate this particular law, they will be punished. So this is how laws ensure that the market is working in a fair manner. So the second example is of the environment related laws. So earlier there were no laws related to environment, and that is why each and every industry, wherever they feel like, used to set up and they used to pollute the water, the air, so on and so forth. So when the laws came up, when the environmental laws came up, there were such laws which did not allow industries to be set up in the city. Right, so these particular laws actually didn't allow the industries to do whatever that they wanted to. Right, it prohibited the industries to set up in the city, in the center of the city, and therefore we could say that laws basically encourage the people to be more fair, because they know that if they wouldn't be fair, they will have to pay the penalty for violating that particular law. They will be punished for violating that particular law. So I think that you got what I'm trying to tell you. Moving on to the next question, which says, discuss the various roles of the government that you learned about this chapter. So the very first law of the government, the very first role of the government is to provide the public facility. To provide the public facility, which is not particularly from this chapter, which is particularly from the previous chapter, but still it is the responsibility of the government. It is basically all the 3 points or all the roles that we are going to discuss are correlated or interrelated with each other. So public facilities is one of the roles of the government. The government is responsible for providing the public facilities to the people by making it accessible, affordable to everybody. The second thing is that it basically has to make laws. It is responsible for making the laws for basically make laws to protect and safeguard the workers from being exploited. From being exploited. So basically what happens is that it is the role of the government to make the laws in order to protect, in order to safeguard the poor workers from being exploited by the private companies. And these laws, one of the example is the Minimum Wages Act. The third role of the government is to basically enforce, to implement these laws that they have made in order to protect the workers, to enforce these laws. The third responsibility is to enforce these laws that the government has made in order to provide justice to the people. Now, no matter the laws has been made in the country, but if nobody is checking if the laws are being followed or violated, how can this actually give justice to the people against whom the laws have been violated? The laws are actually made to protect some people, or to safeguard some people from being violated. If that particular law will not get properly implemented, will not get properly checked whether everybody is following, how will actually the target, how will how will it basically achieve the target due to which the law has been made? Because let me be very simpler in this. For example, Minimum Wages Act has been made. This law has been made in the country saying that a minimum wage will be fixed for the workers, and no private owner, no private company will be allowed to give a wage which will be beyond that particular amount which will be fixed, right? So this particular law has been made in order to protect. So the target over here is to protect the workers. But if the government themselves wouldn't implement the law, wouldn't check if anybody is violating the law or is also following the law, if they wouldn't punish the people who are violating the law, then it wouldn't make a difference now. The scenario is still the same. If people are not following the law that has been made in the country, and the government is not punishing the people who are not following the law, and they're still paying the workers very low wages, it still doesn't make the difference. The law doesn't make a difference, but we need to make a difference. That is why a law has been made in the country, right? The law was made in the country to make a difference in the country, and if the law will not be properly implemented, people will violate it and they will not get punished for the same. That is why implementation is very important. That is why the government needs to check whether everybody is following the law and they are not violating it, and in case somebody is doing that, the person has to be punished for the same. So these are basically the three rules. Now the public facility one that I talked was the environment. Public facilities also include environment laws, right? Each and every person, clean environment is also one of the public facility that we talked about in the previous video. Not just water, not just health or education, but environment is also one of the public facilities. And here the government is responsible for providing public facilities such as environment, health, water to the people, because everybody deserves to live in a pollution-free, clean environment. Okay, moving on. How is environment treated earlier? What has been the change in the perception discussed? How was environment treated earlier? So environment was treated earlier very badly. It was actually considered to be a free entity. Now what do we mean by free entity? Basically, free entity means every industry, if it wishes to pollute or how much it wishes to pollute, it used to get set up anywhere that it wanted to, and used to pollute the entire area where it used to be set up. Nobody used to check whether the industry was putting the waste garbage into the rivers or how much the industry is polluting the air. Nobody wanted, or nobody has ever checked that. So environment was a free entity. Anybody used to come in, pollute and go out. Nobody used to check, nobody used to punish the people who used to pollute the environment. So environment was considered to be a free entity. And what has been the change in the perception? The Gopal Gas Tragedy was the change in the perception. The change in the perception is the Gopal Gas Tragedy. Gopal Gas Tragedy is basically the change in the perception. After that tragedy happened, it caused so much damage in the country that it actually opened the eyes of so many of us in the government itself that there should be some laws that would protect the environment. There should be some laws to protect the workers, right? And that is why the laws were being implemented in our country related to environment, because now people realize that in case that it doesn't now protect the environment, we will not be able to survive in this environment in this year after many years. So it is now high time to protect the environment, and so environmental laws were being implemented after Bhopal gas tragedy. After so much damage was being done, now the government was like, okay, now they realize now environmental laws are needed to be implemented, otherwise it would harm the environment so much that we will not be able to survive. And that is why environmental laws were implemented after Bhopal gas tragedy. It opened the eyes of government as well as a lot many people. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the questions. Now we move forward to the quick revision very quickly. Okay, so the very first point says, to protect the people from exploitation, the government makes laws which try to ensure unfair practices are kept at minimum. Yes, so the government, we all know that government has to make laws in order to protect the environment and the workers from being exploited. Both the environment and the workers were being highly exploited, and so it is the duty, responsibility of the government to make laws in order to protect both of them. Many laws have been have their basis in the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Indian Constitution. Now over here in this point, we're talking about the right to life. We're talking about right to life. Under Article 21, we're talking about right to life, and in Article 21 it says that the government has to ensure that the laws are being implemented in order to protect and safeguard the workers from being exploited. Companies prefer to start operations in countries like India, as one worker can easily replace another, and many workers are willing to work in an unsafe condition. Now here in this point, now after understanding the laws are to be implemented in the country to protect the citizens or the workers from being exploited, now let's come to the next point, which says that why did even Union Carbide established its industry in India at the first place? Why did that American company establish itself in the India at first place? There were many reasons that we discussed. One of them was cheap labor, which is one worker can easily replace the another. This was cheap labor. One of the reasons was that they get cheap labor in India. That is why it is very advantageous for them to set up their industry in India. The second reason was that there are no such strict safety rules that are to be followed by the industry, and that makes it very easier for them to set up. Right? It is very easy because it cut down their cost. Also, they do not have to go through long legal procedures to set to set up their industry. It is very easy. You give money to the officer. If he is corrupted, he will make it very easy for you to set up your industry over here in India. Right? The government is supposed to ensure that safety laws are implemented. It is also the duty of the government to ensure that the right to life guarantee under Article 21 of the Constitution is not violated. It is what we discussed in the previous slide, that Article 21 under right to life says that the the workers as well as the environment are not being exploited. From Gopal Gas Tragedy, we saw that the negligence of the government and the company was the reason of a hazardous disaster. Yeah. As I told you that after the Bhopal gas tragedy, it opened the eyes of the government that they need to make environmental laws in order to protect, and they need to make safety laws for the workers in order to protect the workers also. And because of the lack of safety laws and the lack of environmental laws, so much damage was being done to the people as well as the environment, and now it is high time to make these laws. Okay, so the next topic that we read was the Bhopal disaster brought the issue of the environment to the forefront. It brought the issue because it opened the eyes of the government as well as the people. In response to this, the Indian government introduced new laws on the environment. Yes, after the eyes of the government were being opened, they realized that now it's high time, and so there were many laws that were brought to in the country. And one of those were that in Delhi, it was said that the industries which are being set up in the center of the city or in the city, they should be either shifted to the outskirts or they should be shut down, which majorly exploited the poor people, because the people who used to live around the industries used to work in those industries, and when we shift the industries to the outskirts, obviously their job will be lost, right? And it will again exploit the poor people. Now in order to protect the environment, we are again exploiting the poor people. So such laws should be made in the country which would protect the entire society and not just one part of the society, which is environment, and exploiting again the another part, which is the poor section, the vulnerable part of the society, which also needs to get protected. So the laws were made, but they were exploiting the poor people in some or the other way. The right to life is a fundamental right under Article 21 of the Constitution, and it includes the right to the enjoyment of the pollution-free water and the air for full enjoyment of life. Yeah. So right to life under Article 21 also says that it is important for it. The government is responsible to ensure that the workers are being protected from exploited. Also, it is a duty of the government to ensure that the environment is pollution-free, because each and every person deserves to live in a pollution-free environment, to have a pollution-free water, to consume pollution-free water, to live in a pollution-free environment, in a clean house, in a clean accommodation, and have sanitation facilities, have a good house, a clean house, pollution-free environment, and a good air to breathe in. So basically, the government has to ensure two basic things under right to life under Article 21: that the workers are not being exploited. Second, the environment is not being exploited. So this brings us to the end of this video. We'll connect in the next video. By then, thank you so much for joining me on Study Room.